Hi, guys. Today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I interview Professor Michael Jahosky, author of The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. And we'll get to all of that right after this. I've been using Coinbase.com and the Coinbase app for cryptocurrency for about 2 years now, which makes it really easy and safe to buy, sell, and store digital currency like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Sign up now and use my link at christiannerdsunite.com/Coinbase and get $10 of free Bitcoin when you buy or sell at least $100 worth of digital currency. Join 43 million other people who buy, sell, and manage their crypto on the world's most trusted crypto exchange. Check it out at christiannerdsunite.com/Coinbase. And now, back to the show. I'm really excited to share with you my interview with Michael Jahosky. Michael teaches humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida and released his book, The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth, last year. But before we get into the interview, let's read some scripture together. We're going to read Ephesians 6:10-17. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything to stand, stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take up the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Now, this passage comes to mind quite often when I'm reading through The Lord of the Rings, just because of some of the symbolism here. Talking about the powers of this world and much like the seeming supernatural evil that Tolkien wrote about. The hobbits and the men and women in the story take up the physical armor and weapons, while we must take up the armor of God and the Word of God as our defense against the evil of this world. I pray that you will take up the armor of God and the Word of God on a daily basis. Now, let's get to my interview with Michael Jahosky. Michael, welcome to the show. It is great to have you.
Happy to be on, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, you are you're a professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. Is that right?
Yep.
And the author of The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. And I'm pretty excited about this book. I'm in the middle of it right now, and some interesting things that you bring up. But kind of tell us who is Michael? Why do people know Michael?
Oh, well, I guess I should probably mention the nerdy part of me first, given the podcast. So I grew up a Nintendo kid. I take my Switch Lite with me everywhere. I tell my students some days I'm in a mood. We should settle grading disputes with Smash Brothers matches if we get to it. So I'm a kid at heart. I know that's very cliched. We hear that a lot, but I mean, for goodness sake, if you know me, you know it's true. Big Pokemon fan. I've had to catch up on a lot of my youth. We moved around so much as a kid, so I use that as my excuse to say, oh, I can play this game now. Super psyched that ActRaiser just came out, an old favorite Super Nintendo game of mine. I don't know if anybody's familiar. ActRaiser 1, not 2. The music, so it really a trip down memory lane in the last week. So I should start with the fun. Not that the other parts aren't fun, but I'm a big nerd, and I love my Nintendo games. So I'm a husband, a father, an author. I've got two wonderful kids, Lucas and Annabelle. They're 7 and 4. Keep me busy, and as you said, I teach humanities at St. Petersburg College here, where it's hot year round. So we've got nice, crisp 98-degree weather still, and enjoying it.
Awesome. Well, since you wrote the book about Return of the King, let's start there with your experience with Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in Tolkien's writings and specifically in the Lord of the Rings? Where did that start with you?
Yeah. So I tell the story in the preface of the book, but my nerdy, I've got two brothers and two sisters. My nerdy older brother Chris, and I mean that, of course, in the highest respect to him. He got me
Absolutely.
into, yeah, it's a compliment. And his love for the books, and clearly he had been reading them. I didn't know that he was in 2001, right before the movies came out. I don't know how long he had been reading them before that, but he said, we ought to read this before we see the movie. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So before December of '01, my brother Chris started reading me The Fellowship of the Ring, and that was my first encounter. We didn't finish the books, or that book, and I didn't finish any of the others. I didn't get to the Silmarillion until a few years later, as I gradually started devouring the books after the movies came out, and kind of finished them as I went. I don't remember exactly when I finished what, but as I got kind of hooked on it because of him, we saw the first movie, and then I started reading and just didn't stop from there. And I was one of those, guys who had to point out all the differences. Of course, the books were just infinitely better. Oh, that's not how it happened.
Agree.
Oh, yeah,
Absolutely agree.
with the Hobbit movies especially. My God, yeah, I know that's another thing.
Don't get me
Another,
started on the
don't
Hobbit
get me started.
movies.
We'll be here 2 hours. Yeah. Yeah, that's how I encountered it. It's funny. I look back and I tell the story in the book is that my mom had, we grew up Catholic, and so Catholicism is still close to my heart, and we're still trying to find a perfect, I know there's no perfect church, but we're still trying to find a good church home right now between Catholicism and Protestantism. Anyway, my mom, we all kind of stopped going to church, and then around 2000, 2001, my mom rediscovered, Christianity. She had gotten in a really bad car accident. And I saw her faith kind of, expanding and becoming important. So I would sit with her, we'd read scripture. And that happened around the same time Chris was reading Lord of the Rings. I didn't see any kind of connection between the two as I was rediscovering my faith and discovering Tolkien for the first time. But it's been interesting to look back and see how those two things were actually related years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I know traditionally people say that the Lord of the Rings is not allegorical
Mm,
because Tolkien says in a particular letter that he despises allegory basically,
sure.
and that it was never intended to be an allegory. But I know in your book you kind of bring this around a little bit. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I'll give the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of these words, allegory, metaphor, parable, they all have a lot in common. I wouldn't say
Mhm.
they're all equivalent. That's hardly the case, but they can often say the same thing in different ways. One biblical scholar, Klein Snodgrass, his work, Stories with Intent, was really helpful, where he said that for years, biblical scholars have been trying to make a distinction between allegories doing one thing as a genre and parables doing another, that in fact they're both sometimes translucent to the reality they want to show. And I think the concern, just to start with this, for Tolkien was that he didn't want people, even seeing it as a Catholic and broadly Christian book, to just see that and not any of the merits of the story. He didn't want, just like he was annoyed with certain interpretations of the book, so he didn't want it to just be reduced to that, to get in the way, right? But the truth is, Snodgrass says, parables and allegories, if you try to say that one does a worse job at kind of concealing the intent of the story and the author, They really don't. So I found that there's a lot of slipperiness with these terms. Okay, and as I dug even deeper, I found that allegory more broadly is something that Tolkien did not despise. He disliked, and despised probably is a better word, even though he used the word disliked in the foreword to the second edition of the Lord of the Rings. What you find when you look at other letters like letter 186 and letter 181, if you're familiar with the Humphrey Carpenter collection, and several others, is that it was one specific kind of allegory that in letter 131 he said was a conscious and intentional allegory. That's the one that he disliked. But when you read, I think it's letter, I'm looking here, it's letter 186. He says that the Lord of the Rings is an allegory, just not of atomic power, but of power exerted for dominion. So this was pointed out by a Tolkien scholar, Catholic scholar no less, Joseph Pierce. And I said, well, that's interesting. So it's an allegory. It's just not that kind of allegory. And I'll stop there for now, because that was the first kind of mind grenade for me. As I said, wow, so he doesn't hate all allegory. He just really disliked the very transparent, translucent, in your face, maybe Bunyan-esque type, and I don't want to knock C.S. Lewis, because I don't think his books are all that allegorical. People say that all the time, but I think they're more well told than people think. That was the first big point in my journey. So I think that's a good start to the subject.
I was about to say, is that kind of what set you on a course of writing this book, or was there something else?
That was the thing. Yeah, Ricky, that was really the main, I would say, motivation. Although I also wanted to write for myself, because there was just this weird, I said it was weird at the time, and I don't feel guilty for it anymore. And it's a silly thing to feel guilty for, but I related in a strange, symbiotic way to the characters in the book. And I was just like, I felt like I was being summoned, and with the character of Aragorn, I'm like, oh, I want to go and follow him. I want to go do that. I want my life to feel urgent. And I thought, I can't imagine I'm the only person who's ever felt this way about a story. And so at first I was feeling, I know it sounds weird, but kind of shame and like, well, it's just a fantasy book. And as I read some serious scholars like Peter Kreeft and others, he has a passage that explains this appeal, that it's buried in our subconscious, that we want an Arthurian-like king. We want a cause to devote ourselves to. I started, making connections, thinking, well, this is what Jesus is. And so that was another reason. I had to explore the books and make sense of it for myself. But yeah, then I was frustrated. I'm like, well, how can I write about that, and how the book reflects and communicates the truth of the Christian worldview without squelching and silencing the voices of the other cultures Tolkien loved so much, and without just saying that it's another way of reading your Bible, because it's not. And it's not just a reductive retelling of the Bible. How can I do that when Tolkien was so adamant against allegory? So I juggled those two things, and that's what I write about. So the introduction in chapter 1, which is a hefty portion of the book, is dedicated to kind of laying the foundation and the groundwork, and then getting into that. And then once that's out of the way, the rest of the book is all about that feeling that I had, that summons, if you will. So that's why I wrote the book.
Now, one of the other things that you kind of lean into is, as far as the allegory part, is there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of allude to the idea that it's hard to separate when you say something is allegorical. You can get it from, as you said, Tolkien talks about the intentional allegory written into the story,
right,
and the unintentional allegory that we as readers perceive from the text. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I certainly can. And let me also recommend for your viewers and listeners, and yourself, if you're interested, a shout out to another Whipped Stock author. My book was published with Whipped Stock. Gisela Kreglinger has a great book about, I think it's George MacDonald, and some other authors, and more broadly about Jesus's parables. The book is called Storied Revelations. And this was a revelation reading her book, because she was talking about the same sorts of subjects, but with different authors. And she mentions Tolkien a couple times, but she reminds us that biblical scholars have shown that allegory, and again, allegoria is a Greek word. It means vaguely to speak one thing, to speak of something else. So anything that speaks of something else, right, is the most general meaning. But she says, look, we can distinguish between allegory as a composition, that is a type of literature.
Mm,
We can also speak of allegoresis, which is interpreting a work that isn't allegory and composition, but as one, which is what you alluded to. And then we can also speak of allegorical as a mode of languaging. That is a way of using language. And she says, and I'm quoting her pretty loosely here, but this is the gist of what she says, that allegorical language is much clearer than opposed to what? Metaphorical language, which we can talk about later. But
mm,
it's very, its purpose is not to advance knowledge, it's to remind you of what you already know. So therefore, it's more transparent. So it might be like a thinly veiled character that really is just a pushover for Jesus, or some other stark Christian theme that should be blatantly obvious. It's more direct, and so it's not really trying to conceal the message so much. And that's allegorical as a mode. And I think that what was really helpful, I say a couple times in my book, that can be helpful in helping us understand how Tolkien used this word allegory. He
mm,
never felt the need to be overly technical, but I think using scholarship carefully today, we can possibly infer that he was sometimes, on the one hand, upset about when a work became a whole allegory as a composition, whereby what this would entail is having the whole text be filled with that allegorical languaging, which is very clear. And he says, I think, in his introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, just that, is that the whole work has to amount to this equals that. So he disliked that. But I think he also alluded to a dislike of too much of the allegorical mode in a story that, like his own, that is not going to ultimately be dominated by that, but by more suggestive kind of language and better concealed language. So I think maybe making the distinction between composition, allegory as composition, and allegorical as mode is very helpful for people looking to get into Tolkien. But it requires, looking outside of Tolkien scholarship to see what biblical scholars and textual critics have said about these terms. So it's a lot of research.
Well, as far as Lord of the Rings goes, I mean,
Mhm.
anyone who's a writer, what they have experienced is going to be poured into what they're writing.
Mhm.
And Tolkien admits himself that it is a Christian story because he is a Christian.
Mhm.
He grew up Catholic, so he even basically calls it a Catholic story at some
Mhm.
point, simply because that's who he is, and who he is going to come out in the story. Um,
Precisely.
so a lot of people have also talked about other things, more secular things in his life that
Mhm.
affected the Lord of the Rings story. Do you have
Mhm.
much to say about that? Because I know a lot of people have alluded to the idea that, well, it's somewhat, they feel like it's somewhat influenced by his experiences in World War One,
Mhm.
or some of his beliefs as far as um, you know ecology, or some of his thoughts on the industrialization of the world at the time. What do you know about that? How
Sure.
do you feel about some of those ideas?
Not my area of expertise, but I would say I feel that all of these things broadly fit within a Christian reading and telling and reading of the Lord of the Rings, because if we plug these things into a Christian framework or worldview of reality, we should be caring for creation. We should be concerned with other cultures and religions, and Christianity not domineering them, but finding a way of them fitting in with the complete narrative. So, in the Christian worldview, these other religions that have truth in them too get an honored place, because if you believe that Christianity is the complete truth, and God, as C.S. Lewis said, sent good dreams to the pagans to pave the way for him, right, and to point to him. So God was communicating to all people across the earth. So I think these are all topics that fit nicely in Tolkien studies. And while I don't know much about them, I do know about some of the other cultural influences on the text, but the other topics not so much. But I would say that this all fits within what would be a Christian vision of reality. Okay, so that it's not like there's this complete vision and that complete vision. I think that the Christian worldview is a very broad and capacious worldview that makes sense of lots of different disciplines and areas of studies, and I think makes the best sense of even scientific exploration and investigation. Right, science fits in better with Christianity than it does with some other worldviews, although it does fit in with other worldviews as well. So I would think, and of course his experience in World War One and living through World War Two, and knowing, people like Lewis who were active in, uh, with soldiers and things like that. All of these influences are there, but that's not what his story is about. And on the second thing you said, you kind of started with, that he's clear about this being a Christian broadly, but specifically Catholic understanding, that's found its way into the text. Well, he says, he uses the word deliberately in one letter. He says, I have deliberately created a story out of certain religious ideas. His words exactly. Those words, certain and deliberate, are pretty powerful indicators of what's going on. So I think it's beyond dispute. But understanding how it's Christian is another thing my book goes into. Is that, what does that mean? Well, like I was just saying, it means that it's a very broad and capacious understanding. It brings a lot of things into its, underneath its umbrella. Whereas I think a lot of people come to it and think, oh, it's just going to be about Bible stuff and Jewish stuff and Jesus, and that's it. And it's going to ignore all the Anglo-Saxon imagery and the other topics that Tolkien cared about. And no, not at all. And there have been wonderful authors who have written about all of these subjects and more. You know.
Well, and I was going to say, do you feel like that this is? Do you feel like the Lord of the Rings is a Christian story?
Yes, I do. I really do. And I go into in chapter 2 of my book exactly how that is as a good news story. And I make the case that parables are perfect vehicles for communicating the kind of worldview that Christianity is. I think one of the biggest things I talk about in how it's Christian is very broad, is that, like many of the other pre-Christian narratives have this too, and I think it was on purpose because God created all people in his image, is that all these great traditions have creation, fall, redemption, restoration, these four parts we typically talk about, four themes or parts or acts, if you will. And um, I specifically, coming back to the Christian definition of these acts, if you will, or themes, I explore how those are borne out in the text. And I think that's what makes it, one of the things that makes it inherently and thoroughly Christian. But another thing is, and I go into the fact that it is bringing in the other pre-Christian mythologies, is another indicator that it's fully Christian, because that's what Christianity claims. I mean, that's another sign. And then last but not least, I talk about the art of the parable, which is an essay slash sermon that one of Tolkien's good friends and correspondents in the letters, Father Robert Murray, who was a Jesuit, he corresponds with about a lot of religious information about the Lord of the Rings. And Murray goes on later in 1992 to write this great little essay on it. And I explore how the Lord of the Rings is a parable and what that means for how it communicates the truth of the Christian worldview. So yeah, I unpack a lot in the book, and it's really a labor of love. I try to address all those big questions, and I have to do it very slowly, but I get to it in time. There's a lot there. Tolkien was a smart guy.
Well, talk to me a little bit more about the idea of parable.
Yeah, sure.
Talking about the Lord of the Rings as a parable versus an allegory. What does
Yes.
that look like as a if a story is a parable versus an allegory? What does that look like?
Sure. Well, so let's try to imagine a spectrum, if you will. And I kind of set this up in my book, and I didn't want to bog it down with tables, but this is one thing I wish I probably should have done. But as I've said in a lot of my interviews, that if you imagine a spectrum, and it kind of appeared in my mind as I was reading and researching over the years, that it seems, okay, as we said earlier, Tolkien doesn't have a problem with allegory in general, or even allegorical language. So again, distinguishing between composition and mode. But it depends on how it's used and to what end, and how heavily it's leaned on. So if we imagine that, and I make the case that, in saying the Lord of the Rings is a fairy story, and then in that other letter I mentioned, he says it's an allegory, that a fairy story is a type of allegory. So I settle in my book that we have a spectrum. So back to the design, right? The sketch, a spectrum of allegory. And on one end, we might suppose we have the one he disliked. And this is a simple version of what I imagined. And that's the conscious and intentional allegory. And as we said, this is very heavy-handed. The theological vision, the moral messages, the ultimate thematic content that the author wishes to convey are going to be just obnoxiously obvious. And it's going to be clear that you're reading this story, but the story itself is not well told. It's really a story about another story or about something else. And you're meant to be looking through the story to that something else. And I think this is what Tolkien really disliked. I don't get that sense. It came to me gradually over the years that this was a Christian story, and how it was a Christian story was a very slow process. And I know I may not make it seem that way in the book, but it was very, very slow. So on the other end of the spectrum, we might have parables. And in fact, many biblical scholars have pointed out that parables could be seen and spoken of as a type of allegory. And then according to Snodgrass, who I mentioned earlier, you could reverse it too with little difference. You could say there's a bunch of parables and we can name different kinds of parables, and allegory could be a type. It doesn't really matter. And so I go with the word Tolkien kind of used a lot, which was allegory. So we have our spectrum. We have the one he disliked on one end. On the other end is parable. Now, what makes this different? Parables, if we look to Jesus, if we look at what people have written about Jesus's parables, they're known for being very suggestive and implicit. And I'll kind of put it this way. I can't remember exactly where I got this from, but this is an insight cobbled together from a couple of different authors. But it's something like this, that Jesus established a pattern that when you want to talk about something, you don't talk about what you want to talk about by doing so directly. And so I've done a lot of research in parables as indirect communication. And so we know Jesus was very indirect. He could have just said, "Hi, everybody, I'm God." He doesn't do that. And a lot of skeptics will say, well, yeah, Jesus doesn't say he's God in the Gospels. Well, he does actually. He just does it in a very Jewish way, as Brant Petra, a Catholic scholar, said. And we have to understand that. And the way he does it is indirectly through parables. And so parables are indirect. That means they're very suggestive. They're kind of sneaky, if you will. But then they have this twist, this gut punch. And Kreglinger talks about a good parable alternates between that clear, very familiar speech, that allegorical speech, kind of leading you on and luring you in and, making you think it's about one thing, when all of a sudden there's a twist in the story and there's a chink in the story where you can kind of look through and peer through the glass to see, wow, this is a Christian story. And that's that shift, she says, to metaphorical language, where there's a surprise, there's a revelation, and a new insight. And so I know this gets a bit technical, but parables are metaphorical stories, but they also sometimes contain, obviously quite so, as a type of allegory, allegorical language. And they shift between that very clear, transparent speech and that very suggestive speech to keep the listener guessing and challenged, so that you can wrestle with the text probably for years and years. And look at this. I mean, we're still wrestling with the words of Jesus. I think we always will be. And Tolkien's, is a classic. I would never, of course, put it on the same level, but it's a book that is not easy to summarize and reduce and whittle it down to one bullet point. I think it's because it's based on that art of the parable. Jesus, was Tolkien's Lord, and this is who he loved more than anybody. So I think that really shows. So that's just the tip. Sorry.
No, that's great. So when we're looking at the Lord of the Rings, what do you feel like what do you think is the big Christian idea that we should see when we're reading the Lord of the Rings? What's the one thing that, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if we should have it in mind when we're reading, or if you feel like this is the one thing we should walk away thinking after we've read it. But that idea.
Yeah. Oh, I've got two, but I'll start with just one. At the end of chapter 1 in my book, if you don't mind, I'll read a little something here. The Lord of the Rings as parable. Okay. So I say at the end, and I'm wrapping up the chapter, in conclusion, this book's central thesis, that we can learn more about Christianity and reality from a fantasy book, does seem a bit of a stretch. Can we really learn more about Christianity and reality by entering a story filled with elves, dragons, dwarves, and magical rings? The real question is, can we know anything about reality without myth? We have learned that everyone has a worldview and describes reality in narrative terms. And I go on to say that the Lord of the Rings is a Christian story. But there is this one point, and I think this is it. I'm skipping ahead a little bit to the end, is that it's this message that we still live in a world with brokenness and evil and sin and suffering, And a lot of critics, I'll quote one in a second, Ralph C. Wood, they look at the story, The Lord of the Rings, and they say, oh, you see, it's a sad story. And that means it can't be Christian. And this contradicts exactly what theology teaches us, but also what Tolkien says at the end of On Fairy Stories. He says the Christian has to still suffer and work and die, but he does so with a purpose. He knows it's not all in vain. That's a loose paraphrasation. So I think that's one of the things I challenge some of the prevailing Tolkien scholarship, that no, it's a sad story, and that's what makes it deeply Christian. It's a story that's filled with death, and Tolkien said that one of the major themes was death, and I think that's what makes it Christian. And so I say, Ralph C. Wood, one of the enduring enigmas, he says, left by the conclusion of The Lord of the Rings is how to deal with its surpassing sadness. And I agree. But Wood believes that this is because it is, like the Christian story it resembles, an unfinished story of broken people in a broken world, which is still plagued by the specter of death. But I go on to say that reality is not what it's supposed to be yet. We sense that it ought to be different. I quote Timothy Keller here saying, there's a tragedy and a sadness to life from which no amount of celebration or rejoicing can provide a full escape. And Keller there is talking about the gospel. And I see that in The Lord of the Rings. And so I think it's that consolation that Tolkien spoke about in On Fairy Stories, escape, recovery, consolation. That's one of the biggest things, that the most profound and significant reasons it's a Christian story, is that we should take comfort from the fact that, I know that sounds strange, there is still suffering and death, but we know that Christ is with us, Christ is risen, and things are going to be made new again. So I challenge that notion, because most Tolkien scholars will say, this is why the incarnation is not present in the story. It's still far off. It's not a fully Christian story because it's sad. And I challenge that. So that's the one thing.
Well, and there's even I'm trying to remember the exact quote because I always will get it wrong. And I believe it's Sam to Gandalf, where Sam basically says, are all sad things going to become untrue?
That's it.
I've always thought that's such a poignant idea that, that Tolkien does have this really, really dark story. And, in the end, Frodo is not able to even stay in Middle Earth. He has to leave. But in reality, everything is just being passed on. Everything's being passed on to Sam. Sam is the future. Sam is the hope for what will be. Frodo is what was and what is past.
That's right.
But I've always thought, you were talking about the sadness and death, and it is a huge part of the story. But I think there is hope. But we have to realize the hope is passed on to the next generation.
Well, and you nailed it, and you were right about the quote. And then look at the end of the Lord of the Rings. That's what Frodo says to Sam. To just piggyback on what you said, he says to Sam after he discovers that Frodo's got to move on. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. And for you nerds out there, this is at the very end, final chapter of Lord of the Rings. So in the one-volume edition, it's page 1026 through 29 there. I think that's my Kindle edition. But anyway, it's towards the end. You'll know where it is. And I say this really reminds me of the principle in Matthew 16:25, that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And so, that would be the segue into there are plenty of things that I think clearly windows in the story that just, I guess, maybe broken glass that, the sunlight pours through, and we see those glimpses that this is the story of reality, the Christian story being told here, without ruining the story, without spoiling it. In fact, one of Tolkien's fans wrote in once and said, look, I'm not a believer, but it's like there's light from an invisible lamp present in your mythology. And that's exactly the art of the parable. I mean, that's brilliant, is that I can't see it. I mean, I can see the light, but I can't see the source. And that to me is just, it speaks for itself.
Michael and I talked so long, we needed to make a part 2 on this episode. So don't forget to tune in next week to hear part 2 of our interview. And consider getting a copy of Michael's book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes down below, so definitely check that out. Well, that's all I have for you today. So don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, click all those links. Whatever links are down there, just click all those links. And you can find all of our social links, our online store, and links to our YouTube channel at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, click on the support tab. We would love to have you as a Patreon. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing, and this one's a little bit different. This is the blessing that Elrond gave Gandalf when they were leaving Rivendell in the Fellowship of the Ring. Look not too far ahead, but go now with good hearts. Farewell, and may the blessing of elves and men and all free folk go with you. May the stars shine upon your faces. We'll see you next week. Blessings.